Hey folks, welcome back. We are finally to the Affliction part, having covered Destruction and Demonology. So, without any further delay, let's get into the video. Starting with the Covenants then. Affliction is pretty much locked into a choice of one or the other, being Night Fae or Necrolord, Dreamweaver versus Marilith. And the reason for this is Dreamweaver is pretty much your bread and butter for 99% of content, and will break Dreamweaver further down in a moment. But Necrolord is the pure single target. You are going for a mix of raw single target damage, but also ramping execution damage. So let's go into Night Fae specifically first, and then we'll discuss Necrolord afterwards. So then, Night Fae to start. Dreamweaver specifically is the top dog and has been for a while for Affliction Warlocks. This is because of things like Dream Delver, which is a 3% damage increase, which is maintained through your dots, so in AoE situations you can keep a flat 3% damage on everything. You also have Field of Blossoms, which is your haste amp by 15% every minute, which lines up well with every other Dark Glare and our big cooldowns, so we have a huge amount of haste during burst windows with Dark Soul Misery and things like that. And Decaying Soul Satchel was previously our default legendary anyway, prior to double legendaries being used. We'll discuss what complements Decaying Soul Satchel well once we get onto the legendary section. Moving on to Necrolord, however, we have the theoretical best single target covenant for Affliction Warlocks, with Marilith being ideal because Kevin's Oozling. Once you use Decimating Bolt, you get 6% damage increase. The problem with Necrolord and Decimating Bolt is if you're talented into Drain Soul, which you likely will be for pure single target encounters, and the kind of execute damage, because you've got to remember Drain Soul deals increased damage when the target is below 20% health anyway, which means that you are building this execute style with Affliction by going Necrolord. The problem is that you need to cast that entire buffed Drain Soul. Like, you cannot clip it, so you can't channel half of it, stop, move, do something else, because you end up losing the buff, because it only buffs the one cast of Drain Soul by 100%, and with Shroud of Annihilation that's increasing its critical strike by 100% and its crit damage by 50%, so this is a really, really meaty, powerful Drain Soul that cannot be clipped for its entire duration. So there is a level of play required, and mathematically it is the best of the choices. But in a practical sense, it actually loses out to Night Fae. Like if you go to Warcraft logs or you have a look at other Affliction Warlocks, you'll find that 99.9% of them are actually just running Night Fae. So with that, let's discuss the Conduits. On screen you'll now see 5 potency conduits. These potency conduits are the Affliction conduits of choice when it comes to dealing damage. You have your Fatal Decimation versus Soul Eater. These are your Covenant specific conduits, so if you're running Night Fae, you'll obviously have Soul Eater, and if you're running Necrolord, you will have Fatal Decimation. Focus Malignancy is your default that you're going to have in at all times. This is your Malefic Rapture, deals 15% increased damage to targets suffering from unstable affliction. This is a single target choice, but with the way that our tier set works, you're pretty much going to want it in all the time. This does mean that you then have Withering Bolt versus Rolling Agony, and this is whether or not you're doing Mythic Plus or you're doing single target, and where your priorities lie, because Withering Bolt, Drain Soul or Shadow Bolt, if you're not having Drain Soul talented, deals an 11% increased damage per damage over time effect you have active on the target, or 22% if it's Shadow Bolt. Rolling Agony increases the duration of Agony by 8 seconds, assuming you have it capped out at 278. And these are the ones you're going to play with. For Finesse and Endurance conduits, they're very much the same like they were previously, so I'll just quickly throw them up on the screen, but these 5 conduits will see you through everything. Unfortunately, Affliction doesn't have the best conduits in the world. Like, the other conduit that we do have access to, which is Corrupting Leer, which reduces the Agony and Corruption have a chance to reduce the cooldown on our Dark Glare. That would have been a lot better if we still had a 3-minute Dark Glare, but they changed it to 2 minutes, so it now syncs up really well with Dark Soul Misery, so we don't actually want to desync it further. So, unfortunately, that kind of gets left unless you're going to PvP. So, now we've discussed the conduits, let's go into the talent section, where things get interesting. Starting with the single target talents, then you have Drain Soul, Siphon Life, Dark Pact, Phantom Singularity, Mortal Coil, Haunt, and Dark Soul Misery. Now, this is your main default single target build. There are some variants to this setup, which we're about to discuss, but this is your general go-to build if you just want to kind of copy and paste. Now, Inevitable Demise is one variant that we can have within this section, and this is because Inevitable Demise, which is a talent where your agony ticks ramp up the damage of your next Drain Life, stacking up to 50 times, is actually comparable to Drain Soul in single target. However, the moment you end up in a situation, at least from a raiding setting, where you might have extra adds or an additional target to cleave off, then Inevitable Demise becomes a lot stronger, especially if you're Night Fae. The reason for this is because, if you remember, Soul Rot enables your Drain Life to cleave up to 4 targets, and those Drain Lives will benefit from Inevitable Demise if you have a 50 stack going into it. So you can do a considerable amount of damage, and is more of a, almost like a burst setup, as it were, because you can do a considerable amount of damage with these Drain Lives. However, if you can Shard Snipe with Drain Soul, then Drain Soul can still hold its own. Now, for newer Warlocks among you, Shard Sniping is essentially where you quickly swap to a target that is about to die and Drain Soul in order to regen a Soul Shard back quicker than you might have otherwise without Agony proccing your shard for you, because remember, it can take up to 10 ticks of Agony for you to get a shard. Quite a slow way to generate shards because it's completely random. But with Shard Sniping, you can force the issue if you have lots of targets dying. If you can't abuse that though, then Inevitable Demise will pull ahead on some fights. Siphon Life is generally your go-to. It is an additional dot that you have to manage, so if you want a more passive option, you can use Absolute Corruption, but you will lose out a little bit of damage, because you've got to remember, you have abilities like Withering Bolt, or Conduits rather, like Withering Bolt, where your Drain Soul deals, or your Shadow Bolt deals additional damage based on the amount of dots you have on the target. 11% for having Siphon Life up is quite a big single target increase. Now, the level 30 row, you do get that variance. I've discussed it in my other videos. You can use Dark Pact versus Burning Rush depending on which Covenant you're using. Burning Rush gives us mobility at the cost of health, so if you're running Necrolord and you don't have access to Soul Shape, you may want to use Burning Rush instead, because you do have Fleshcraft as an extra defensive. Alternatively, as Night Fae, Dark Pact gives you a shield, and you've got the mobility awarded to us by Soul Shape. It's a good trade-off. Demon Skin's a good passive option, but loses out to Dark Pact and Burning Rush generally. Now, the 35 row, for single target encounters, you're looking at running pure Phantom Singularity. The other choices start becoming relevant when we get into the Mythic Plus side of things, which we will discuss in a moment. And the same can be said for the tiers, or the 45 row, because there is an argument to be made, but generally speaking, you will be running Haunt. The 40 row is entirely up to you. Generally speaking, you're going to want Mortal Coil in a single target and raid setting, because it is a heal. Howl of Terror is generally a PvP option because it is an AoE fear, and Dark Fury reduces the cooldown on Shadow Fury, so rather than it being a minute, it's 45 seconds. Still not the greatest, as it is a casted stun, but you may need it for a particular reason. Now, for the 50 row, you're pretty much always going to run Dark Soul Misery because it is a 2-minute haste amp cooldown, which pairs up perfectly with Summon Dark Glare, which is our big Affliction cooldown. It's not as strong as Tyrant or Infernal, but it is a dot extension and can allow for a lot of extra damage. Primarily through the pairing of these two cooldowns. Creeping Death is a 30% increase to your dot damage. They do their damage 30% faster, and Soul Conduit, as you know from the other specs, it refunds a shard, or has a chance to refund a shard. For Affliction though, because we only have 2 shard spenders in the form of Malefic Grasp, or Malefic Rapture, or Sow the Seeds, we don't really need the extra. It's not like we're Rain of Firing where something costs us 3 soul shards. Onto the AoE side though, where things really get interesting. So now we have the multi-target or Mythic Plus talent sections. You have Variant 1 on the left hand side of the screen and Variant 2 on the right. Now, Variant 1 is quite popular with high-end Affliction Warlocks within Mythic Plus at the moment, and Variant 2 is the recommended Sow the Seeds build. Now there's 2 different reasons why you might want to play these builds, and we're going to discuss them now. Writhe and Agony and Sow the Seeds is has been very popular throughout the course of Shadowlands because it does a considerable amount of AoE. Sow the Seeds itself is a hugely powerful AoE talent. Doesn't really provide any benefit in single target, which is kind of a problem, and it has absolutely no interaction with the Affliction Warlock tier set at all, which is a real shame. If they changed the 4 set to give us a free Sow the Seeds or something, then that might be quite nice. But the playstyle shift with Sow the Seeds and Writhe and Agony is you kind of want everything to be really clumped up. You want Death Ball style pulls. The reason for this is because you can get more benefit out of applying your Writhe and Agonies, but you're actually reapplying Corruption through Seed of Sow the Seeds or Seed of Corruption spams. Alternatively, if you're going to have a more spread out and more kite style of pull, where your tank is kind of aggressively moving and not everything's clumped up really tight for Sow the Seeds to be efficient, you then have something where Absolute Corruption and Vile Taint is more beneficial. Now, Absolute Corruption makes your corruption permanent on PvE targets and increases the damage as a result. In doing so, it frees up a lot of globals, especially in larger packs where you just Sow the Seeds once, you maintain your agonies throughout, and then that gives you the ability to Drain Soul, Malefic Rapture where required, and use Vile Taint. Now, interestingly enough, Vile Taint versus Phantom Singularity, although Vile Taint is your good middle ground, it does alright AoE and it does alright single target. However, it becomes comparable to Phantom Singularity in damage once you start hitting around the 7+ target mark. And it's on a long enough cooldown that you can make full use of that damage. It also has a snare component as well, which is quite nice, especially if you're not running a group where, you know, there's Frost Mages or you're throwing out Curse of Exhaustions all the time. So having Vile Taint is a nice bit of extra utility, although it's not something to necessarily worry and focus around. Now, Inevitable Demise and Grimoire of Sacrifice aren't highlighted here, but they do have some places where they can be useful. Grimoire of Sacrifice procs off your dot damage. You sacrifice your pet as a result, so this does mean that you could, rather than having your pet out, whether it be your Fell Hunter for interrupt or something like a Voidwalker, and I'll mention Voidwalker in a second as to why, but if you sacrifice it, you gain an ability from your pet. So your dots will then have a chance to proc additional damage, which can be quite significant, especially in larger pulls. But if you sacrifice your Fell Hunter, you gain your ranged interrupt, so you still have a ranged kick, 24-second cooldown, that hasn't changed. If you sacrifice your Voidwalker, however, you actually get your Voidwalker's health cooldown. So on a 2-minute cooldown, you can increase your health by 30%, and kind of becomes like a warrior's last stand if you need the extra defensive. Might come in clutch, but it's an option. Now, generally speaking, you will want to keep Haunt. Although it is the single target option, it is a 10% damage increase when you have Haunt applied to a target, which is much better for priority damage and for boss fights, which is where we kind of get into Affliction's rather weird profile at the moment, in that you don't excel at everything. you kind of become a jack of trades. Like, you can do respectable damage, and you can quite comfortably clear 20s and things like that, but you're not going to be anywhere near as flashy as the Destruction Warlocks or the Demonology Warlocks that are out there doing dumb stuff. Now, the other option was Inevitable Demise. Now, Inevitable Demise goes back to kind of the single target discussion that we had, where you do have an option to have burst every minute, and a really significant amount of burst as well, in that you, while playing Night Fae, you can Soul Rot into a 50 stack Inevitable Demise across 4 targets, because you've got to remember, every time Agony deals damage, you get a stack, which means in AoE settings, if you're Agony 4 or 5 targets, these stacks ramp up very, very quickly, to the point where you can actually have a 50 stack Inevitable Demise every 20 or 30 seconds, so you can get multiples in between these Soul Rot windows. But at the same time, you do also have the option to Shard Snipe. So you get a lot more shards back, which then go into things like your Malefic Raptures and also the Seeds. So these are kind of your default variants, but there is scope for you to play around and move things around. Same with if you want to go Demon Skin rather than Dark Pact, or use Burning Rush if you're in something like Necrotic Wake. Burning Rush will come in really handy on the last boss. Whereas Demon Skin is just a passive. You're not going to take as much damage throughout the dungeon, but you lose the ability for a, oh shit, I need a huge defensive situation, because Dark Pact does give you a considerable amount of health. So, now we've discussed the talents, let's get into the gearing section, where things get a little bit murky. Unlike the other 2 guides I've released, you're only going to see the dungeon bis gear. And the reason for this is because Affliction's a little bit odd. You really only care about haste and mastery. Crit and verse do have their place, and you might naturally have some on some gear, but ideally you're in this position where you just want as much haste and as much mastery as you can, because haste increases our dot ticks, while mastery actually just increases the damage of those dot ticks. And it's a much more stable playstyle than something like having a high amount of crit and hoping for, you know, RNGs to be kind and just have you crit a ton. From a raiding perspective though, if you go to somewhere like Wowhead, you'll actually see that the gear listed isn't actually tier gear. And the reason for this is because you're kind of wanting to use the creation catalyst, or you're wanting to use certain bits, and it kind of dictates which legendaries you're using as well, and they're kind of up in the air. But you're going to want to favour haste and mastery where you can. So things like the majority of the tier set, for instance, you can run all 5 pieces if you're using the correct legendaries. However, the legs are actually the worst statted tier piece for us because they're crit versatility. So what you'd actually want is the other 4 tier pieces, and then, like, say, the legs from Muzala. Muzala's Hex Thread Sarong, which is a huge haste and mastery pair of legs, and would be much more beneficial to you gearing wise. Now, one of the benefits that we have with the Creation Catalyst being out now is you can get that quote-unquote bis tier set pieces by converting Mythic Plus gear that you get into those tier slots. So there's not really a whole lot to say in terms of the actual gear, but let's get into the trinkets, because the trinkets give us a little bit more scope to play around with things. So moving on to the trinkets then, you can see that there's a selection on screen. In the top left you have Soul-Letting Ruby next to Unbound Changeling, IQD or Inscrutable Quantum Device underneath that, Solaria's Secret Technique, Elegy of the Eternals or Elegy of the Eternals, and Imperial Ordinance. Now, generally speaking with Affliction, your 2 strongest all-round trinkets are Soul-Letting Ruby and Unbound Changeling. Soul-Letting Ruby is the strongest on use because it lines up perfectly with Dark Soul Misery and also our Summon Dark Glare. It's a fantastic trinket and gives a considerable amount of crit. Unbound Changeling is also one of the best passive trinkets in the game, with a very, very strong proc. Obviously, if you can get it to roll all stats, which you have a chance to do once per day, then it is incredibly powerful. Failing that, you have Elegy of the Eternals or Solaria's Secret Technique, which are both perfectly good passives to go along with it, in that they both provide secondary stat to varying levels of degree. Solaria's Secret Technique, you find someone in your group that has a high stat that you want, Mastery, Haste, and you put it on them. You then gain 106 of that stat at Heroic or at 262 item level, and they then get 17 of that stat, so they get a little bit for it. Elegy of the Eternals takes 10% of your, or takes your highest stat, gives you 115 of it, and then shares 10% of that to everybody else across your covenant that is in your group. Now, IQD, Inscrutable Quantum Device, is a very, very strong on-use trinket, and in some places is actually stronger than Soul-Letting Ruby. The major drawback to that, however, is the fact that it is a 3-minute cooldown rather than a 2-minute cooldown. And long gone are the BFA days of 3-minute Affliction builds. Now, Imperial Ordnance does need an honourable mention here because it is by far away the strongest AoE trinket for Affliction Warlocks in the game, for hectic ad-cleave situations or just for Mythic Plus. It does a considerable amount of damage, and unfortunately it's a trinket I don't currently have, hence the icon on screen is a 236 Mythic version, because I've just pulled it out of the Dungeon Journal. But sim-wise, it is almost double the value of an IQD. So if you're lucky to get it, keep hold of it, because it is a very, very strong trinket. Even a 236 version will outclass a 278 IQD. That's kind of the scope of how strong that trinket is for AoE Affliction. Now, having discussed the trinkets, let's move on, shall we? So, onto the legendaries then. On screen you have 4 Affliction legendaries, and these are partially interchangeable depending on the content you're doing and what your needs are. Now, Malefic Wrath is the pure single target legendary, and this is the legendary that pairs the best with Necrolord by far and away. So if you're playing Necrolord Affliction for something like Skolex, Malefic Wrath is by far your best, because this further helps to amplify the damage of your Drained Soul or Shadow Bolt, stacking up to 3 times. This does further push that fact that you have to maintain that buffed Drained Soul when you're casting it, so be prepared to hit a defensive if you need to soak something in this process, or if you know the fight timings, you can move things around slightly and delay it for a better time. Relic of Demonic Synergy is a passive. It's quite a good multi-discipline legendary if you are going to be dabbling in other specs from time to time, because what this does is it increases the damage done by you or your primary demon, so your Fell Hunter or your Imp or whatever you've got out, and has a chance to grant the other one 10% increased damage for 15 seconds. So you might grant your pet 15% extra, 10% increased damage, they might grant you it. It has a reasonable amount of uptime, somewhere between 15 and 20% over the course of most fights, and this is the go-to legendary if you are Night Fae. The reason for this is because this kind of plays into Night Fae's ability to cleave as well. So if there are other mobs present, or there is going to be a point where ads do become present, there is going to be a point where you can get this benefit, or your pet gets this benefit, and you are doing 10% increased damage for those 15 seconds. And if that happens to be you're doing the 10% increased damage, this really helps with your AoE, because it does affect all your dots, your cleave, your soul rot, your drain lives, the lot. Wrath of Consumption is the Mythic Plus go-to. This is because your Corruption and Agony grants an application of Wrath of Consumption when a target dies, increasing all periodic damage that you deal by 6% for 30 seconds, stacking up to 5 times, and is refreshed at max stacks. This isn't one of those things where you stack to 5, you have 30 seconds, then you've got to restack to 5. So in Mythic Plus situations, when you've got lots of ads dying, especially with encrypted mobs now, for boss fights, you can keep this extra 30% damage going into boss fights, and you can maintain it for a while into a boss fight. So you can refresh it at the start of a boss fight with all 3 relics, Relic then goes down. You've just got 2 stacks of Wrath of Consumption, refreshed onto however many you had prior to the boss, and another 30 seconds. You then dot then dies, say, 20 seconds later, and he's just refreshed your full 5-stack Wrath of Consumption. This is also powerful on weeks like Spiteful or Explosive, when you have extra things going on that can further help extend. So if you've got spiteful mobs running towards you, you can just dot them and keep running. And that's really strong. Perpetual Agony of Ajikir, though, gets an honourable mention for raid fights where there is considerable amount of cleave. Think Prototype Pantheon in the current raid, where you're putting Agony on multiple targets and maintaining it. Having a 20% increased chance to generate a Soul Shard will then allow you to pump further Malefic Raptures onto your targets and extending your dots through the 4-piece. So all in all, it's quite a good legendary, but generally speaking, you're in a much better place if you have Relic of Demonic Synergy, Malefic Wrath, and Wrath of Consumption. That about wraps up today's Affliction Warlock guide. I haven't covered everything as in-depth as the other 2 guides, and unfortunately the main reason for that is Affliction doesn't perform as well as the other 2 specs, but if you want to set foot in it and play around with it, it is still perfectly viable up to 22, 23 keys. As I said, there are Warlocks out there doing it. So to cap off this video, I've unblurred the background of the Affliction 17 Mists that I did, and you can kind of see the end result, my end damage, and kind of just generally fighting through Tredova, even though there are a few mistakes. It wasn't the cleanest run, and hopefully this video has helped you. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment below, and if you like the video, hit me up with the subscribe. It'll be much appreciated. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great evening.